Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is Tuesday, September 8th, 2020. We are back from a 3-day weekend. I hope you enjoyed it. Got a little rest and relaxation, or R&R, as they say, and you're ready to attack this week with an enthusiasm unknown to mankind. I know I am. Let's take a look at our board today, guys. We've got project review. That's the first thing on our to-do list. We're going to go over that project we just spent 2 days on. Understand it a little bit more in depth. Then we're going to talk about democracy. That's a vocab word. It's a very important word in this country. Hope that you know what it is, but if you don't, we're going to talk a little bit about it, and you're going to have a little bit of an assignment to do with that. I will give you that assignment. I'll give you an attendance question, and then I'm going to give you some quiz prep because, yes, we are having a quiz next class on Thursday. I'm sorry. I apologize, but I swear on it, we will be having a quiz next class, okay? Last week was a one-off. I was nice for some reason. I don't know. I threw you a bone. Definitely having a quiz this week, all right? So we got to go over today's information, last class's information, the class before. All that's going to be on the quiz, okay? So I'm going to prep you for that, let you know what's going on. But first, excuse me, let's start with the project review. If you don't have your pieces of paper out that you guys filled in last classes, go ahead and get those now. And while you do that, let me say great job on making this work. Some of you can't print it out and you had to draw the entire sheet. That's totally fine. You did a great job. I'm proud of you. Well done. Others of you typed it in. Great. Totally cool. Not worried about that at all. You guys are doing awesome. But let's start with our project review. So we had 9 events that we had to talk about, kind of summarize, and then rank as what was the worst one that caused the most trouble and which one was the least trouble. The first event we talked about was the Proclamation of 1763. Now, what I'm going to do here is explain each one of these. So if you need to add to your notes, that's totally fine. Or to the sheet you sent me, totally fine. Add to it. But basically, the Proclamation of 1763, and I just realized we're going to have to scoot this puppy over. There we go. We'll switch sides. Was an act or a statement. To proclaim something basically means to make a grand statement. So, the King of England, who I should tell you at this point, if you don't know, is a guy named King George the Third. It's the Roman numeral for King George the Third. He makes a proclamation, a loud announcement. Now, he didn't just scream this. He wrote it down and he let everybody know. It's basically a rule that the colonists could no longer move west. Remember in our PowerPoint in the French and Indian War, the colonists kept moving inward and going westward towards California, Colorado, Arizona, Texas. They didn't just stay on the East Coast. They could only go inward. The king was not having it. He said, King George, nope, you can't move west. Now, why did he say this? Because if you remember, the one thing about the French and Indian War was that the British lost a lot of young moolah, baby. And he didn't want to lose any more. He thought if the colonists moved west, what would there be another? There would be another war. So the king said, listen, we're not going to have any colonists moving west. You guys have to stay where you are. Don't move west. And it was the Proclamation of 1763. He proclaimed that the American colonists, not known as American yet, but the colonists living in modern America, were not allowed to move west at all. And that dividing line was basically a set of mountains called the Appalachian Mountains. And he said, once you hit the mountains, you can't move past them. Imagine that today. Imagine if President Trump told you you couldn't move somewhere. Wouldn't fly. It would not fly. And it didn't fly. The colonists got really upset with this proclamation because they realized we moved to this new land to be free, and the King of England is still going to try to control us however he can. All right, let's move on to the second event. And just like that, we are on to the Quartering Act of 1765. If you noticed, I cleaned up these notes for you just so I can give you a better understanding right here. King George III announced colonists were not allowed to move west of the Appalachian Mountains because he didn't want another war with the natives. Now, the Quartering Act of 1765, number 2 on our event list, very simple but a little confusing because of the word quartering. You hear the word quarter, you think of young moolah, baby, money. But no, to quarter basically means to house somebody, meaning to let them live there. If you've ever heard or seen a movie that has to do with the Army or the Navy, they always say something along the lines of, go back to your quarters. That means where you live, where you're sleeping, your bed, your area. So the Quartering Act of 1765 is all about living situations. And in this act, King George III was trying to save money again. Why is he trying to save money? Because he just spent so much of it on the French and Indian War. So he's trying to save money. He didn't want another war, and now he's trying to save money. So he says, I'm creating an act. And this act is basically going to say that the American colonists have to house the British soldiers. Anytime that they need it, no, you don't dot your L's. Anytime that a soldier needed to be housed, it was up to the American colonists to house them, let them live in their house, and pay for their food, pay for their drinks, let them sleep in a bed. They had to give them quartering. It was ridiculous. Imagine now if you had to let somebody come stay in your house who you never knew from another country, who was only there to make sure you didn't get out of line. Would not fly again, of course not. But that was the Quartering Act of 1765. Let's move on to the next one. Next, we have the Stamp Act of 1765. And I should tell you right now that you can replace the word act with law. Basically, anytime you see act, what that means is it's a law. So the Stamp Act, or the Stamp Law, which no one calls, but maybe helps you understand, was written by the king because he was, again, trying to get money. He lost so much money, and the crown lost so much money defending the colonists in the French and Indian War that he was trying to get some back. And he thought to himself, well, if we helped defend the colonists, they should also have to help pay back the debt that was incurred. So what he did was this. He created this Stamp Act that said anytime a colonist bought a paper material, and when we say a paper material, that can be things like playing cards, it could be a newspaper, or even if you loved someone and you needed a marriage license, he said you have to buy a stamp to place on that piece of paper to show that you paid for it. Now think about that. What do we get today to show that we paid for something? A receipt. Now imagine that when you get your receipt, you have to pay for your receipt. Whew! The colonists felt the same way you and I feel about having to do that now. They were not thrilled. Not only were they not happy that they had to pay a tax on stamps, but they were very unhappy that they didn't get to decide any part of this law. And what that ends up being called is a popular phrase that they would repeat over and over. They felt they were taxed without being represented. And they came up with a phrase that maybe you've heard, taxation without representation. And basically what that means is this. They understood that there might have to be taxes, but that since they lived there and they were colonists of the British government, they should get to vote. While they were living in this new world, they were still technically considered British. They were British colonists living in this new American world, but they felt if they were going to be taxed, they should get to have a say in it, and they were being taxed without being represented. Nobody from the United States, modern day United States, the colonies that they were living in, was going over to Great Britain and voting on these laws that the king was passing, these acts. So they were very upset. They got so upset that they decided to boycott buying anything that was paper. That's another vocab word, boycott, where you just say, nope, I'm not going to buy that anymore. And eventually, the Stamp Act was repealed. And what does repealed mean? Basically, it means taken away. They took the law and they said, all right, fine, that wasn't a good law, we'll trash it, and they repealed it. Let's take a look at number 4. All right, number 4 is the Townshend Act, and that's named after Charles Townshend, who was the new British Prime Minister of England. And basically what a Prime Minister is a leader of the group of people who make laws. This guy decided he was going to create another tax. However, this wasn't your normal tax. This was called, or what we call, an indirect tax. And I'll explain that in a second. But it was put on any purchases that involved glass, paper, tea, or lead. And basically what an indirect tax is a tax that's much different from the tax you know about. When you go to the store and you buy a candy bar, the price tag says 99 cents. But are you paying 99 cents? Nope. It's going to be about $1.04 or $1.03, right? Why? Because of a tax. An indirect tax isn't a tax that you see and pay after. It's built in to the price. So instead of you paying 99 cents for the candy bar and then paying a tax on top of it, you would pay $1.04 for the candy bar. And that's what the sale sign would say. It's a candy bar, $1.04. Charles Townshend did this because he hoped that the colonists wouldn't notice this tax. And that's very important because they did. Hoped colonists wouldn't know. However, the colonists were smart people, and they figured out that the prices were going up. There was an indirect tax that was being put into these types of items. And again, just like the Stamp Act, they boycotted buying anything that was glass, paper, tea, or lead. All right, guys, number 5. The Boston Massacre, a very easy one to remember because it was exactly what it sounds like. It took place in Boston, Massachusetts, one of the 13 colonies, Massachusetts, and was a massacre where 5 colonists died. And here's how they died. There were British soldiers all throughout the city of Boston. They were very easily spotted because they wore an outfit that was very red. They were beginning to get harassed by local colonists. The colonists were calling them names that you and I probably wouldn't think are very mean today, but they called them redcoats and lobsterbacks because they were so red. But after the name calling, they started throwing snowballs and ice balls and things that started to do a lot of damage to the soldiers. The soldiers opened fire on the crowd and killed 5 colonists. The British people were fuming mad and wanted the soldiers to go to trial to pay for what they had done. The British accepted this and said they would go to trial, and the British soldiers were actually found not guilty. a man named John Adams, defended them. He was a lawyer, and he would later become president. His son would become president later on after him. But John Adams defended the British soldiers to show that this new nation of colonies, these 13 colonies, would be governed by law and not in an unjust way like divine right theory, where we would have kings who got to do whatever they want, but rather laws that ruled all the people. I'm going to show you a quick clip of this right now.
Yes? Can you breathe? My son. It's your boy. Murderers! Come away. Come away, Sam! Shoot me too, Preston. If you dare. Sam! Sam, come away! You'll suffer the full mercy of the law! Sam! These people need to be tended to. These people need our help. Yes?
Next, we have the Boston Tea Party, yet another event named very aptly and easy to remember. The British Parliament passed the Tea Act, and what that did was it said colonists were only allowed to buy tea from a very, very specific company, and only one company. The colonists were not happy about this at all because, again, more decisions were being made without approval in their mind. They had no say in this. They didn't like the tea. They also thought the tea was overpriced. And they didn't like the fact that they didn't have a deciding factor or a say in what company they used. So, a gang called the Sons of Liberty, and not a gang like the Bloods or the Crips, but a gang of colonists who wanted rights and freedom and who fought for good, not bad, they organized an event where colonists dressed up as Native Americans with feathers and face paint and dumped 340 chests of that tea out into the Boston harbor. They boarded the ships at night. This was all illegal. And the amount of tea they dumped out has been estimated to be worth what would be $1 million back in that time. Needless to say, the British were not happy about this, as we would see next. Next came the Intolerable Acts, also known as the Coercive Acts. They were called the Coercive Acts in England, but the American colonists could not tolerate any of these acts. They thought they were completely unreasonable, so they renamed them the Intolerable Acts. And as we said, this was passed in response to the Boston Tea Party. After the Boston Tea Party, the British government was incredibly upset, so they passed this act that did 4 things. Until money that was lost from the Boston Tea Party was paid back, the port of Boston was closed. The port is where you would receive shipments from things. It's the ocean's little harbor where ships would come in. You would drop off and take things off the ship that you needed: food, tea, maybe even playing cards, things like that. The port is also where you would ship things out that you were selling to other countries. This meant a huge deal to the Boston people because they couldn't receive anything in and they couldn't make money sending anything out. Also, the Massachusetts legislature was suspended. A legislature, which we'll talk about later on this year, is basically another word for the people who make laws and govern. So they said, Massachusetts, you are no longer in control of your city, your state, your colony. You have no sovereignty. You are not allowed to make any laws. The third was that British soldiers that were committed or accused of committing a crime would be tried. To be tried means to go to court. In England, the British government said, we don't trust you guys at all, and we can't trust that you'll give our British soldiers a fair shake, a fair trial, if they commit a crime. So they have to come back to Britain and England to be tried if they're committed or accused of committing a crime. And finally, the fourth thing was a reinstitution of the Quartering Act, where soldiers were allowed to stay with colonists or in homes of colonists no matter what the colonists said. It was totally up to the British government. They could say, this person is staying with you and you must provide shelter and food and drink for them. Next, we have the First Continental Congress. Not the second, the first. We'll talk about the Second Continental Congress in a few classes down the road. But for now, talk about the First Continental Congress, and that's another easy one to remember because it's exactly how it sounds in the title. First, I don't know how else to explain that besides first, not second. Continental means from across the continent, and Congress means to gather. If people are congressing outside of your house, they're gathering outside of your house. And that's what this was. It was a gathering. Members from 12 of the 13 colonies that we've talked about sent representatives together to meet in Philadelphia, which was kind of a generally easy to get to in the middle location they decided for the 13 colonies. This was in response to the Intolerable Acts. All these things that the British government had done, they decided we need to band together as colonies, put aside our differences that we have, and present our complaints to the king. They also wrote letters to the people of England saying, hey, how do you think we feel over here? We're being taxed without representation. We're not being able to live freely. We have soldiers in our homes. We can't send things out of our port. We can't receive things. So they were trying to let the world know how they felt. They also, more importantly, decided at this Congress to boycott all trade with England, meaning nothing traded to England and nothing brought in from England. None of the 13 colonies were going to allow this. They all kind of stood together with Massachusetts after Massachusetts had kind of been fairly punished, or unfairly, I should say, unfairly punished. They stood with Massachusetts and said, we're going to boycott all goods to England and all goods from England. And finally, number 9, the battles of Lexington and Concord. But before we get to that, I want to do something here. Pause real quick, and I want to say the word lollipop. Lollipop. The word is lollipop. Remember this word. You're going to want to remember this word later. Now, moving back on to the battles of Lexington and Concord. These were the first 2 battles of the American Revolution, which was a war that America and the 13 colonies would fight for their own freedom and independence. Lexington and Concord were 2 towns in Massachusetts, and what happened was that British troops in the middle of the night marched to Concord, and they were trying to take away all of the colonists' basically war supplies, their guns, their ammunition, their gunpowder, all the things that you needed at this time to fight a war. The British troops were sent to go and take. However, the Minutemen were alerted by a guy named Paul Revere. If you remember this story from when you were a kid, Paul Revere rode on his horse and said, "The British are coming, the British are coming." And he lets this group of people know, the Minutemen, who were basically an army that could be ready at a minute's notice. So they were called the Minutemen. Not necessarily an army in the way you would think of it today, very large and a lot of weapons. It was more of a militia. A militia is a smaller, much, much smaller army. Not a lot of leaders, not generals, not a sense of order, but a group of people working together with one common goal. And this Minutemen militia, their goal was to protect the colonies at a moment's or a minute's notice. So the Minutemen were alerted that the British were going to steal these supplies, and they cut them off in the town of Lexington. And in Lexington, battles ensue, fights occur, guns are shot, people lose their lives, and the British actually are considered to have won these battles because they push on back to Concord and destroy some of the gunpowder that the colonists hadn't used from themselves. But the main thing is, this showed the colonists that war was imminent. It was close. There was no mistaking what the king wanted to do. They knew that they were about to go to war with Great Britain. All right, guys, I know that took a little bit longer than expected, so we're going to get this class over with real quick. I told you, today we're going to talk about democracy. We're not going to talk about it so much as you are going to do a little research on it. I have sent you, hopefully I actually sent it this time, I sent you guys this document. It looks just like this. It says Classifying Governments. What you're going to do today is you're going to do this top half. Where it says distribution of power, don't do anything underneath that. Do everything above that. But I'm going to show you some pages in the book next. We're going to cut to some pictures. And it's going to give you pages 18, 19, and 20. And what you're going to do is simply just read those pages and complete the following chart by putting 3 facts about a democracy and 3 facts about a dictatorship in these boxes. Again, if you can't print it out or you need to type it in there, that's totally fine. Drawing, doing whatever you do, everything you guys have been doing is great. So that's going to be today's assignment. It's going to be the first half of the, what is it titled? Classifying Governments. Classifying Government handout. All right. The first half, or the top half, however you want to look at it, that's what your assignment is going to be today. You're going to do some research. Now, your attendance question. Since this was a long video, I had to throw the attendance question for a little bit of a loop today. What's the weird word that I said earlier when we were discussing the 9 different events that we were kind of summarizing in our Colonial Unrest matrix? I stopped at one point and gave you a very weird word and said, pay attention, you're going to need this word later. It makes no sense in the context of everything that we were talking about. What was that word? That's all you have to do for your attendance question today. All right? Next, quiz prep, very simple. Your quiz is basically going to be on, well, that's upside down, the matrix that you guys have been working on, that we reviewed today, plus everything from before that, okay? The majority will be from the Colonial Unrest matrix, all right? There might be a few questions about John Locke and social contract theory. There might be a couple questions about the Magna Carta or the English Bill of Rights. I don't know. Maybe 1 or 2, but the majority will all be about your Colonial Unrest document, the 9 events that we just reviewed that you guys have been working on as a project for the 2 days before this class. All right? That being said, we got nothing left. I'll go ahead and I'm going to post those pages that you'll need for today's assignment. Make sure you email me the attendance question immediately when this video ends. Right after it ends, email me that attendance question, and then go ahead for today's assignment, complete the first half, the top half of our classifying governments sheet, take a picture and send it to me, and I'll be able to give you some credit and some participation for today. That being said, I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your Tuesday. We'll see you next Thursday for Quiz Day! I guess.
All right, guys, here's the beginning of the 3 pages that you'll need to read and find the information for your 3 facts on democracy and dictatorship. And right here, just to let you know, you don't need to read this bottom part here, okay? You can stop reading right here at Characteristics of Democracy.